Good evening, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about 3 verbal operands that are used every day in applied behavior analysis to promote functional communication within our learners. Those 3 verbal operands that we're going to be talking about today are mands, tacts, and interverbals. So each of these are a verbal operand, but they're super different, and they each work to provide a different function with our learners. So the agenda for today is going to be first defining each of these terms, because that's super important, and then we're going to use these definitions to distinguish between the 3 at the end of our presentation. So the first verbal operand that we're going to talk about is mands. So when you think of manding, it's kind of in the name. You can think of the word demand, because it's a way for us to request or access items in a functional way, right? So this doesn't necessarily have to be a full sentence, depending on the learner. For a very young toddler, for example, it can simply look like pointing to an item in order to access it. So for example, if you have a really young learner who maybe doesn't talk or is nonverbal, and they walk into the kitchen after just running around, for a really long time, and they point to a glass of water, while they're panting and sweating, that would be a demand. They're requesting the water. And you can see that they're requesting the water because they're indicating that they're hot, thirsty, and then they're actively pointing to it. So the difference between a demand and an interverbal or a tact, which we're also going to talk about, is the SG is a little different. So the discriminative stimulus that evokes that response is different, right? So for a mand to take place, the only SD necessary is the motivation for that item. So you're not asking the learner to do or say anything. They want water. They have motivation for water. Therefore, they're going to ask for the water. The next verbal operand that we're going to talk about is tacts. This is also super important. This can be thought of as labeling things, items, features, actions. If you're, for example, at a park with a young kiddo and they point to a squirrel and they say, "Look, Mom, a squirrel," that's a tact. They're labeling things in their environment. They don't have to necessarily verbalize it. They can sign it using sign language. They can give you a communication icon if they have a picture exchange program going. If they have a alternative communication device, they can use that to label items. Or even if they see something and they write down what it is, that in itself is a tact. That comes with usually asking the learner, like, "Hey, what is this?" Or "What do you see?" And they'll tell you what they see. They'll label it. They'll label items in their environment. The last verbal operand that we're going to be talking about is interverbal. And just like tacts and mands, it also kind of has its own distinguishing feature, which is that you kind of recall it from memory. There's nothing in the environment. So if you want a glass of water and you say water, you point to the water, that's a mand. Or if you see a glass of water but you're not necessarily thirsty and you say, "Hey, look, there's a glass of water," that would be a tact. But for an interverbal, it's kind of like, for example, you ask a kid, "When's your birthday?" and they say September 20th. That would be an interverbal because there's not necessarily anything in the environment prompting that communication. So distinguishing between the 3 is super important, because it's essentially requesting versus labeling versus recalling information. And each of them not only access a different part of the brain, but they also focus on a different skill. And they all teach functional communication, which is the essential goal that we want in all of our learners. Thank you for listening.